Hi, this is Justin, and welcome to Justin's Morning Coffee. I'm going to take a little bit of a break from the seven basic plots today and talk about something a little bit different. This is a YouTube channel called Like Stories of Old, and it brought up something that I thought was very interesting. I don't know who this guy is, but he's a genius. Uh, I'll put the link below. But talking about sacred space and what kind of struck me, and the case that I kind of want to make for you today, is that in the same way that he's going to talk about sacred space and how it's missing from a modern day life and why that is, you could say the same thing for time, sacred time. You might now I don't know if sacred is the right word for that, but let me just see if I can weave together a couple things for you to see what you guys think of this. So here's what this YouTuber says.
Or profane space. More refers to Mircea Eliade, who in his book The Sacred and the Profane explains how our modern society is based solely on the profane and no longer acknowledges the sacred as an ontologically unique space. Properly speaking, there is no longer any world. There are only fragments of a shattered universe, an amorphous mass consisting of an infinite number of more or less neutral places in which man moves, governed and driven by the obligations of an existence incorporated into an industrial society.
How did I lose you? Wandered.
Profane space differs from sacred space in that it has no fixed point or center from which to gain orientation. Profane space has no axis mundi, no cosmic tree or pillar leading to the heavens. This is the experience of modernity, people unable to locate a center.
Okay, so very interesting. Let me go back to that quote. Profane space differs from sacred space in that it has no fixed point or center from which to gain orientation. Profane space has no axis mundi, no cosmic tree or pillar leading to the heavens. This is the experience of modernity, people unable to locate a center. Okay, now if you go to Europe, or you go to any town, okay, you're going to find that that is all oriented around a center. There's usually a Duomo, a cathedral, a steeple, possibly a tree, that basically marks the center of this community, and then everything kind of fans out from there. It is kind of this idea of this idea of the center, and then everything kind of spiraling out from there. Now, it might not seem, you might say, well, is that necessary? I mean, it's kind of quaint. You go to a European city, you're like, well, we want to get something to eat. Let's look for the tallest building. Let's head in that direction. That's probably where the life and vibrancy of the town is going to be. Sure enough, that's what you see when you find there. You're going to find a plaza, you're going to find a piazza, you're going to find a statue with some art and a fountain, and you're going to find children playing, and you're going to try and restaurants, and it's all going to kind of like be concentrated there in the center there, and it's going to thin out as it goes. Okay. Now, what's the experience that you and I have when we drive through the cities and towns that we live in here in America? I mean, maybe you don't live in America, but I live here in LA, and it's that sense of no center. Where's the downtown? It's not downtown LA. Is it Hollywood? Is it over here, over there? And people have been trying to bring it back for a long time. That's what my documentary that I've been working on for a long time, called The Space of Our Time, is all about that. And you'll hear more from me about that soon, because that project is back on the table now. Okay, so I don't think it's a stretch to understand, yes, the sense of rootlessness that comes from a lack of having a center in space, a fragmentation of space, everything. So all profane, it's fine to have profane space. Grocery stores, mechanic shops, hardware stores, whatever it might be. But you when you don't have any sacred space, when you don't have that center, when you don't have that sort of connection between meaning and earth, heaven and earth, you might say, it does create this kind of sense of not having a self, some kind of a disease, kind of a rootlessness, like I said. But what I want to say to you is that while I think that's true, and I think that's something that people can understand, the need for a center in space, I want to say that the same thing has happened with respect to time in our culture, and furthermore, that there is only one place left. Well, not one place left. There's there's a few places left that are dwindling, but one place that still remains, where both of those you might say still exists, is actually in the cinema. Okay, so what I want to do now is introduce you to a filmmaker named Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader, this is a lecture that he gave at the Brehm Center, which I've been involved with over the years, which is a coming together of people of faith and artists for dialogue, and talking about a book that he wrote. He was famously the screenwriter for Martin Scorsese. Screenwriter for Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and Martin Scorsese was Catholic, and Paul Schrader was Calvinist. And they were both, although you could say that both of them were sort of post-Catholic, post-Calvinist, you might say, but still rooted in that tradition and talking about their work in those terms. You know, so the Protestant and the Catholic working together to make films. Martin Scorsese famously saying that he did the same thing in his films that he would have done had he continued on to become a priest in seminary. Okay, so that's kind of the world here. And Paul Schrader wrote a book called Transcendental Style, which is about slow cinema, and it's about recovering that sense of, and I know the word sacred maybe is not the best word, but I'm going to use it anyway because I don't have a better word, but recovering the sacred in cinema, okay? So it's similar to what we were hearing earlier about sacred and profane space, and here he's talking more about sacred and profane time, we might say. Okay, so I'm just going to play you a little bit of this lecture so you can kind of get a sense of what he sees as what he calls transcendental style, and then we can discuss.
50 years ago this spring, I graduated from Calvin and headed for UCLA Film School. The 60s came in like a howling wind and carried me off. I transferred my interest in theological matters into a love of the cinema, specifically the European cinema of the 60s. I had a lot of catching up to do. The Christian Reformed Church's position on film attendance was restrictive when I was raised, and I hadn't seen many films. In Los Angeles, I became a movie buff and a film critic. I saw movies constantly. But I remained curious. Was there a connection between the world I was living in and the world I had come from? In certain films, I sensed a link between the past and the present, a link between a sacred past and a profane present, between the life of the soul and the commercial life of cinema. But it was a link of style, not content. This was the insight I had and the insight others have had before me. Spirituality in art is about the how and not the what. The form reveals the content. Content is crucial, of course, but it is defined by form.
Okay, so right there, he found a link, he's saying, between his spiritual past, his theological past, and his profane present. So Calvin College to Hollywood. That's basically what he said, saying that there was a link, but not in content. Not in the content of the screenplay or the beliefs of the characters or the religious nature of the characters or religious subjects in the films, but rather in the style. And what I want to say, in order to understand this, I think you have to kind of see the link that I'm making here between sacred space and sacred time. Now, sacred space is space that is set aside from the profane. And it's there for a purpose. There's something that's supposed to happen there, but the space itself doesn't necessarily have to be religious in content. You know, mentioned in this video was the idea of a sacred tree. The tree marks the center. So something marking the center around which everything is oriented. You might say that that is the stylistic quality of sacred space, let's say, you know. And so therefore you could see how, you know, it could be a mosque, it could be a temple, it could be a duomo, it could be a tree, it could be whatever, right? But that's what he's highlighting, is this idea of living in a world without that or living in a world with that. What's the difference in that previous video we watched? Now, this is Paul Schrader's doing a very similar thing. He's saying that time, there's a certain sacredness to time. So what does he mean by that? Okay, so in Transcendental Style, this is the introduction to the rethinking Transcendental Style as he's revisiting his book that he wrote in starting in 1971. All right, so basically, the way that you can understand it is that cinema has a certain time language, and it has to do with expectation and result. You set up a desire in the protagonist, and then they go to achieve it, and then the drama is watching the obstacles and opportunities that they have in between them and their goal. So there's tension and conflict set up. He says, let me see, where's a good place. I was a product of the Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids. Paul Vanderklay, if you're watching this might be interest to you. A Calvinist denomination which at that time prescribed theater attendance and other worldly amusements. So naturally, I was drawn to the forbidden, not forbidden, of course, but the acceptable forbidden. I wanted to square. So he was drawn to the forbidden, and I wanted to square a love of movies with my religious upbringing. I'm going to skip down here. 2 years later, it was 1968, and I was in Los Angeles in full pursuit of the profane. Calvin was a memory. Then, as a film critic for the Los Angeles Free Press, I watched the LA release of Robert Bresson's Pickpocket and wrote about it. And I saw it again and wrote about it again. I sensed a bridge, interesting, between the spirituality I was raised with, the profane cinema I loved, and the profane cinema I love. So what's the bridge between the spirituality that he kind of left behind at Calvin College in Grand Rapids and this profane cinema? Okay, and you're going to see this over and over, where profane art makes the jump into the sacred. It seems to happen quite often. Not sure why, but I want to keep exploring it. And he says it was a bridge of style, not content. So that's what he was saying in the lecture earlier. The spiritual time, like sacred space, sacred time, doesn't have to do with the content. It has to do with what? Something else. Church people have been using movies since they first moved to illustrate religious beliefs, but this was something different. The convergence of spirituality and cinema would occur in style, not content. In the how, not the what. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. Okay, over here, 1971. Struggling with the concept of transcendental style, I sought to understand how the distancing devices used by these directors could create an alternate film reality, a transcendent one. I wrote that they created disparity, which I defined as an actual or potential disunity between man and his environment, a growing crack in the dull surface of everyday reality. Okay, so think again about sacred space. Okay, so imagine when I went to Orvieto, Italy, and it's an ancient town. It dates all the way back to the 1100s, and there's all of this idiosyncrasy around the main town square. Little tiny narrow streets, little houses. So that's the world of the profane. That is everyday matters. That's the world of what they would call the secular back then. The normal, in time, non-eternal concerns of the everyday, errands that you have to run, problems that you have to put out, et cetera, et cetera. But then you pop open into this square, and then dominating the landscape is this beautiful Duomo, and you come inside and it's very quiet, and there's a ginormous ceiling, and there's all of this art along the way, and you're filled with awe, and there's this whole otherworldly quality to that place, which defines the center, which is where the eternal and the temporal are touching. Okay, that's kind of how you might think of sacred space. Okay, so he's arguing here. He's arguing here that you can do that also with time. Okay, so how do you do that? Okay, so in the same way that leaving the everyday to go into a cathedral is leaving the profane behind and stepping into the sacred, he would say that you can do that with time in a movie as well. And how you do it is by leaving that convention of desire, obstacles, and goal. So rather than showing a picture of the profane life, which is where you have a temporal goal and then you have temporal means to get there, and then you try to accomplish these goals by going on this series of conflicts, you step out of that and you show confrontational scenes. You show non goal oriented scenes. You slow everything down. So he says, by delaying edits, not moving the camera, forswearing music cues, not employing coverage, and heightening the mundane, Transcendental Style creates a sense of unease the viewer must resolve. The filmmaker assists the viewer's impulse for resolution by the use of a decisive moment, an unexpected image or act, which then results in a stasis, an acceptance of a parallel reality, transcendence. Okay, so it's similar to, I think, when you step into a sacred space, you leave behind your concerns. You leave behind the concerns of the secular, of the profane, of the everyday, and because you're stepping into an eternal space, you're dealing with now the saints of the past, the ancestors, the generations of the past, higher beings, all of that stuff. And so you could think of it as using boredom for a spiritual purpose. So you're breaking that sense of the everyday in order to put someone in a meditative space while they're in a movie. Okay, and so what you have then is this experience of not being pulled in every direction by every little dopamine hit from your phone and all of the concerns of the fragmented time reality that we live in. So I would argue that it's not just a fragmented space reality, it's a fragmented time reality. Okay, and so then Schrader goes on to talk about Tarkovsky, the Russian film. So now we've got Orthodox in as well in the picture. We've got Catholic filmmakers, Calvinist filmmakers, and now we bring in an Orthodox filmmaker. And so Tarkovsky says the long shot is more than just long, it is meditative. The psychological effect of slow cinema's long take is unlike any other film technique. Film techniques are about getting there, so that's the goal, the conflict, the obstacles, telling a story, explaining an action, evoking an emotion, whereas the long take is about being there. So you're not moving through time, you are existing in time, in the present. Julian Haladin in Boredom and Art. Boredom and Art is a great little book. It really is very, very moving and profound. Compares the effect of the long take to a train journey, an early symbol of modernity. The train journey places emphasis on expectation rather than presence. The traveler's mind is focused on the destination, not where he or she is here and now. Okay, so in that book, Boredom and Art, Julian basically says that the train, that introduction of that technology into our society, was the thing that caused us our sacred time, you might say, to break down into profane time. Because when you're on the train and you're looking out the window, the world is moving by past you, and now you're not being there, you're going there. So it's a difference between being there and going there. So think about sitting in the park or taking a walk, without a destination, that's being there. Okay. And so there's a sense that we lost a lot of that. Maybe people still get it by walking their dog or taking a walk, or they'll do it intentionally. But because we have so much technology now that is focused on going there, not just the train, there's also the automobile. There's all kinds of different things that are causing us to move through the world quicker, and so therefore time to move quicker, less in between time, less downtime, less boredom. And what does a world without any boredom do to your brain is the question. So he says travelers can't appreciate being in the present because their perception of time and space is constantly shifting. Oh, it's behind my head. I'll just read it. Motion pictures, like modernity itself, embraced this constant flux. Slow cinema, specifically the long take, sought to reverse the headlong impetus of technology in favor of the present. Okay, so there's something to do with this ability of, or this need that we have to recover, let's say, sacred space and centers for us to orient our lives around, but also to recover sacred time and meditative space. I know it's weird, I'm mixing my metaphors here, space and time. in order to do the same thing with time that you would do with sacred space. Do the same thing with sacred time that you would do with sacred space. And that is the arena in which some of these artists are operating in. I'm just going to give you one example. There's a filmmaker named Paul Harrell, and he made a film called Light from Light, which I saw at Sundance a while back, and it is the most beautiful example. It was only a couple of years ago that he made it, of perfect use of this notion of sacred. I guess you have to say sacred. I don't know. If there's a better word to use, then please let me know. Sacred time in a movie. So I'm going to show you the trailer of that.
Is anyone here? Suzanne?
Felt like something had its hand on me. Felt like my wife. It just feels like she's still here. This is the room where the lights were flickering. I've been staying in here since Suzanne died.
I want a camera in the parlor, one in the basement out back, and one in both of the upstairs bedrooms.
People think ghosts are scary. I think it would be wonderful if they were real.
People thought that I had this gift because of these dreams I'd have. It turned out to be prophetic. I'm afraid you're gonna get hurt.
What do you mean?
You know, is it serious? Don't fall in love with someone just because they treat you nice.
But isn't that what you're supposed to want?
Things only matter if they last.
Amen.
Do you think this is for real?
I think it's definitely real for me.
Let's say it is a ghost and that it's her. Would you want her around? I'm not gonna lie to him. He wants to know.
Does he?
I've never done this. I've never felt something like this.
Okay, so very interesting. This is Jim Gaffigan in a serious role. And, I really highly recommend the film if you can watch it. It's probably on a streaming service somewhere. When I saw it at the premiere, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. It was really something remarkable. And so I'm just going to wrap it up here. Basically the reason I'm telling you this is because I just want to make the case that there are other enclaves within the film world that you might find yourself in if you're, or it could extend to other art forms as well. Maybe the idea of sacred space and sacred time is something worth thinking about. On the one hand, the lack of it in our society, the kind of designing out of those things in our society, and what you might be able to do as an artist to kind of recover some of that in the same way that you might as an architect, or a designer of a town or something. You might be able to do something with time that we are trying to also do with space at this point. So I'm going to wrap it up with something that I wrote after I saw the premiere. And I got a chance to talk to that filmmaker, Paul Harrell, who teaches in college, very similar to me in some ways because he's a filmmaker and a college teacher, and really using a lot of his academic sensibilities in the film as well. So this is what, wrapping it up about slow cinema. This is what I said. Paul Harrell believes in contemplative cinema and sees his role in many ways as someone who guides the viewer in contemplative or meditative practice. Okay, so that's the idea of sacred time. You're using the fact that someone has to be inside of a theater watching your film and get rid of all that secular that secular time, that idiosyncratic, goal-oriented, this worldly concern part of your attention, and using the advantage of the fact that you're in a theater now having to watch this movie. You've chosen to go in there and watch this movie to now guide you in this meditative practice. So the fog that hugs the Smoky Mountains in which the film is set, it's long, slow shots, not much happening. It's really quite something. And if you're not ready for it, you're going to feel just as bored as when you walk into an empty cathedral and you're thinking, well, I got to get going. You know, it's that same sort of feeling if you're not ready to have a transcendent experience. Let's see, the transcendental score and the slow pace all work together to help us relax into the mystery. As Sheila, the lead opposite Jim Gaffigan there, methodically investigates Richard's house, Jim Gaffigan's house, for signs of a haunting using various techniques. All the while, as the two are getting to know each other and in some sense find camaraderie in the wake of loss, disappointment, grief, and loneliness, each of them has lost a loved one and they're hoping to find a ghost. That's the very, very little plot that's in the movie. We are given space and time to reflect on the nature of the unknown, specifically those unknowns that give us pain and sorrow. For Richard and for Sheila, there is a sense in which much of the pain of their lives would ease were the ghost to make itself known. For us, the limits of the possible continue to loom in our consciousness, but as we reflect, we just might, out of the corner of our eye, catch a glimpse of something that could be from the beyond. And that's, I'm not going to spoil it from you, but there's almost nothing that happens in the movie until finally one little tiny thing happens in the end. And that one little tiny thing is so much more emotionally impactful because of how slow the build-up to it was. As Harold put it, Harold the director, reality could crack. Interesting that the art, the sacred time, could cause for you, the viewer, reality to crack. What does that mean? Perhaps all we need to answer Sheila's question in the movie about the apparent meaninglessness of our existence. She does long talks about the meaninglessness of existence. Perhaps all we need to answer that question is one little moment, one little shadowy glimpse, one little crack. Okay, so that's my pitch to you for the benefits of slow cinema. Perhaps an introduction for the first time for many of you to the whole concept of slow cinema, non-narrative cinema, and the value of it. And I would encourage you to explore it if you are a cinephile or if you are a filmmaker yourself. So that was my thought for the day, and thank you for watching. I will see you guys next time.